Now I'd like to introduce two keynote speakers and have a time for Cliff and Helena's keynote speeches, one after another. This will be about 10 to 15 minutes per person. First, Clifford Cobb is the editor-in-chief at the American Journal of Economics and Sociology. He developed the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, ISEW, which was the appendix of the book For the Common Good. As a senior fellow at Redefining Progress, a San Francisco think tank on social and environmental economics, he developed and updated the Genuine Progress Index, or GPI, which was largely based on the ISEW. In his capacity as the president of the Robert Schulackenbach Foundation in New York, he was the executive producer of the documentary film, The End of Poverty, and co-author of the companion book, Why Global Poverty. Cliff, would you please start your speeches with your slides?
So actually, I should start by saying that we need to think of the GDP as a political tool, not primarily as an economic tool. So politically, it served the purpose of allowing the US and European countries to go to war and still be able to maintain their economies. That was the original purpose of it. Now, the secondary purpose was economic. The world had been in a depression in the 1930s, and so one reason for developing the GDP, keep it on the secondary, was to develop macroeconomic guidance using Keynesian principles in order to maintain full employment and to prevent recessions and depressions. However, these GDP models have failed to regulate the business cycle. We are continuing to have the same ups and downs of the economy that existed before, and so the GDP basically failed to regulate the domestic economy, and therefore the managers of the economy turned to foreign policy and said, let us use the GDP for a new purpose, economic development. So in the Cold War, the issue was who's going to control the world, the US or the Soviet Union? At least that's the way the United States portrayed it. So the idea was that we were competing with each other in terms of helping poor nations develop economically. So economic development became the primary tool or the primary purpose for which the GDP was used as a tool to measure progress towards increasing the development of an economy. So the US and the Soviet Union each claimed to be more able to increase GDP of poor nations. But we should see this development, again, not in economic terms of progress, which is the way it was portrayed, but actually as another form of warfare against people in those economies, particularly against people in rural areas. What raising the GDP meant around the world in every country has meant moving people off farms and their traditional way of life and into cities. So another purpose of the GDP related to this was free trade. The argument for free trade is some will win, some will lose, but everyone will be better off if the GDP is larger because of free trade. So in other words, it's a bigger pie, there will be more to eat. But in fact, some people eat less and some people eat more. But the GDP made it possible to sort of erase that and ignore that aspect of what was happening under free trade regimes. So the GDP became a weapon designed to suppress dissent against free trade. Lots of people understood that free trade wasn't good for them, but they weren't allowed to speak up because that was being critical of this development ideology, the ideology that we must increase the GDP at all costs and allow capital to flow freely. All of this was all part of neocolonialism. In addition, raising the GDP increased economic inequality, but people weren't allowed to talk about that. Even today, that discussion is barely taking place. The connection between raising GDP and rising income inequality. So in summary, If you learn about the GDP in school, what you are taught is it's a technical tool for economics. You learn that GDP is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. And you learn how to use it as a tool, but you're never really taught what it's being used for, the political purposes of it. GDP has been a political weapon in a war of modernization, industrialization, and displacement. All of this, in a sense, is a war of modernization against traditional societies, against people who live in practicing traditional ways of life, in particular, traditional agriculture. So its origins in war have never been left behind. It started in World War II, but it continues to be a kind of instrument of warfare. Therefore, GDP should be analyzed politically and not as an economic tool. So the GPI was developed originally as a method of trying to counteract the GDP. The GPI began originally as the ISEW, or Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare. It was created by John Cobb, Herman Daly, and me around 1987. It was based on several prior efforts to create comprehensive measures of a national economy. Generally, economics has dealt only with the market, and the GDP only deals with the market, and the GPI was an effort to say the economy actually is more than the market. It also includes nature and society, and the way in which those interact with the market also need to be incorporated. So in its first version, it was published in the book For the Common Good by Cobb and Daly. It was revised in another book called The Green National Economy. And again, the same second result was published in the second edition of For the Common Good. So the ISEW was transformed into the GPI, or Genuine Progress Indicator, in 1992 at Redefining Progress, based in San Francisco. It was simply the ISEW with some modifications and renamed the Genuine Progress Indicator because it sounded better. On the basis of that work, we published an article in the Atlantic Monthly, and that really made that was the basis of the early success of the organization Redefining Progress. Eventually, the GPI became the basis of models that were developed in about 10 or 12 other countries, showing similar results to what it did in the United States, of growth for a while, but then decline. Generally, that was the same pattern in all countries that developed GPI models. So I have suggested that we need to think of the GDP as a political tool, but if we do that, we must also think of the GPI as a political tool. The GDP has constituencies, the military, corporations, developers, politicians, everyone who benefits by a growing economy and as measured by the growth of the market. The GPI also needs a base of support if it is ever going to succeed. That means political support. Where is that going to come from? Well, unfortunately, the biggest beneficiary of the GPI are the people who have not yet been born, people of future generations. Even socialists, the main dissenters in the current system of capitalism, even socialists want economic growth. So it has been difficult to find a constituency that is interested in the problem that the GPI is about, which is the taking out of pieces of the environment and society and using them in the market, and in effect destroying the environment and society in order to make the market grow bigger. In the United States, the GDP was barely noticed until 1960, when in the US presidential election, John Kennedy promised he would get the economy moving again. Now, he never used the term GDP, but that is in fact what he was referring to. So if the GDP means the economy, what does the GPI represent? Is it genuine progress, as the name says, or is it something else? What exactly is the GPI? And that question needs to be answered, I think, in order to be able to make it a politically viable instrument. So it seems that until the Green Party, which exists in many countries, until the Green Party or some similar organization, some politically motivated organization, can make the GPI popular, it's going to be invisible. It will never truly compete with the GDP. So my primary suggestion, I want to reiterate, is we need to think in terms of politics, not economics. When we fight against the GDP using the same terminology, the same methodology, the same accounting tools, we are fighting on the same ground as the opponent. That is always a losing proposition. If you want to win a battle, you change the terrain, you change the place where you're going to fight. You don't fight on your opponent's turf, on their land. You force them to fight in the way you want to fight. I said, this is like thinking about an elephant. When I say that, then I tell you next, don't think about an elephant. Okay, the word you keep coming back to now is elephant because I've said it. In the same way, when we talk about GDP and criticize the GDP and the economy and the market and so on, all of this is telling an audience, think about those words, think about those terms. If you want to change the way people think, you don't keep using the same language. You have to change the language. You need to reframe the language and stop using the language that your opponents are using, which is the language of traditional economics. So what we need is to figure out a way to present the message that lies behind the GPI. What is the story? What is the GPI in human terms? If we stop thinking about it in technical terms as a lot of numbers added up together that reach some other number and use that to show a graph, to show things are getting better or worse, all of that is very technical speak. It doesn't speak to people's ordinary lives. So if we're going to actually be effective in promoting the ideas of the GPI, we need to think about it in terms of a different kind of message, in particular, a story. So just as an example here, I want to give as an illustration different movies or the television series, Star Trek. Star Trek is all about a group of people who go out into the universe to spread the benefits of American civilization. It's a very American TV show and really all about American neocolonialism operating in the world. So in a sense, that really is what the GDP represents, is that mindset. And the fact that that program, even today, many decades later, is still popular among many people, says that mindset is really the one we have to overcome. So I tried to think of a few movies that give us a different perspective on the world and that is similar to what the GPI is trying to say. Avatar is the most recent one that I can think of that was very popular. It showed a different world in which industrialization and development is ultimately viewed as evil, and and a kind of social connectedness as a basis of society was the positive image of that movie. Koyaanisqatsi is a documentary full of images and no words, and essentially it tells the story of how progress is destroying us and the world. And It's a Wonderful Life is a movie from almost 100 years ago that I'm not going to try to explain, but in any case, I'd say it also, in my mind, represents what the GPI is about. It's about an economy that's made for people and not people made for an economy. That would be one way of thinking about it. So I want, if you're interested in the GPI, to begin thinking about images, to think about stories. Think about how you would explain this to someone who has no interest in economic ideas, but does care about people and the planet. So we need new ways of talking about it. If we're going to win, we have to change the terms of the debate. So what is progress? What do we mean by progress? This really is, I think, the fundamental question we're grappling with. The GDP has been used as a measure of progress over and over again by economists and politicians and other people. So they have added up a bunch of numbers, said those numbers are getting better, and therefore we're better off. So we have turned to numbers because we don't have a way of defining what we mean by progress. The GDP became a proxy, a way of talking about progress using numbers, and then the GPI. But we're using the same mindset that we can use numbers to define what we mean by progress. So I think we need to think in a whole different set of categories about what we mean by progress if we're going to ever achieve something that looks like progress. So one example of this would be if I asked, which civilization was higher, Charlemagne's empire or the Song dynasty in China? Now, those were contemporary with each other, and I believe that one of them was clearly better than the other. The Song dynasty was far, far more sophisticated in a wide range of ways. It gave more people freedom. They were not fighting wars with each other. There were a variety of factors that made it a better civilization. So we don't have to have a number to tell us that one was bigger, it was better than the other. So I just suggest very simply, because I don't want to spend a long time, but 3 sample criteria that we could use to define what we mean by progress, the progress of a society or a civilization. One is the treatment of women. The second is social equality, and the third is the wisdom of leaders. None of these things that I think can be measured by numbers. None of them ought to be measured by numbers. But we can't, well, I mean, we can use numbers as proxies to some extent, but we should also have images and stories and ways of talking about these things, because these, I think, are useful measures of the quality of life of an entire civilization. So how do you define progress? The GPI is mostly a way of saying that the G is something negative. It says the GDP does not define progress. It's a negative message. It's critical, but it doesn't really provide an image, an outlook for what we're trying to achieve. So I think what we need are new ways, and in some cases, that's going to be old ways that we can refashion in new ways to define progress that are not based on measurement, not based on numbers. You just heard Helena Norberg-Hodge talk about her work. I believe that the work she did in Ladakh some years ago, showing a concrete historical example of cultural loss, was to me one of the best ways of understanding what we mean by progress, by showing negatively. She was saying, this is what was defined as progress. It isn't progress for the people living there. We need to redefine what we mean by progress. And that's really the beginning of the conversation we need to have. Can we learn about progress by defining what we have lost? Or can we envision what a better world would look like? Thank you.